Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National, and it is really, really good to have you all here with us today. I'm going to turn it over quickly to my colleague, Jean Marie Nevada, so we can get this really important conversation started. Join me, please, Jean Marie.
Liz, it is always good to see you. Thank you so much, and I know we will see you before the end of the show.
You will indeed.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion for PFLAG National, and my pronouns are she and her, or if you speak Spanish, ella. And every single week we get together to talk about something happening out there in the world related to the LGBTQ community. And today we have a bit of a more serious and I think difficult for some people conversation. And the reason we are doing today's show, which is focused on the conversation of suicide, is because we did a show a couple of weeks ago on mental health, and we got a lot of feedback from people that they needed more. And so we decided that this was the time to do it. And we are so lucky at PFLAG to have really good people to help us. So to just give you an idea of what I am talking about here, let me give you some statistics. So 10 million Americans have seriously contemplated suicide. In 2009, 1 in 5 high school students have seriously contemplated suicide. Fewer than 50% of people who attempt suicide will actually tell anyone. And 1 in 3 people who will die by suicide actually did get help in the last year. And last year in August, the CDC reported that 11% of Americans during this pandemic said that in the last month, they too had seriously considered suicide. I am one of those people. I did attempt suicide once, and I obviously got help and I'm okay, but I have to tell you, it is very hard to talk about even now because there's still a lot of shame and it makes me wonder what people will think of me. But the more I learn about this and the more years I have between that and who I am today, the more I realize it's important that I do talk about it. Fortunately, I never need to do any of this alone, which is what makes me probably one of the luckiest people in the world. And so I want to bring in our guests for the conversation today. And for those of you, once again, who want to look at today's article, please visit straightforequality.org/discussion series, and it'll give you the 2 articles that we're actually looking at this week. So today's guests are 2 really brilliant, phenomenal people, and I'm so grateful for them. So first, we have Sam Brendan, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Government Affairs with the Trevor Project. Hello, Sam.
Hey there, Jean Marie. It's good to see you.
Oh, it is always good to see you. And I'm also going to bring in Doreen Marshall, the Vice President of Mission Engagement with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Hey, Doreen.
Hi, Jean Marie. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Doreen.
I am so glad that you are both here, and I am glad that you are both able to have this conversation with us, because I just think this is such an important discussion. So as we get started, you know, the article that we started, both articles that we actually looked at had to do with Meghan Markle's conversation about suicide and how she was feeling and how that has played out. And it really got a lot of people talking, which was kind of the point of this. So Doreen, I want to ask you, why was it so important that she told her story? And what was it specifically about her story that was so effective in getting this conversation going?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, I think it was important that it was her speaking out, because I think we tend to make a lot of assumptions about who is suicidal, right? And so it's easy to make an assumption that someone, you know, who literally is royalty would never feel suicidal. And so the fact that she was speaking out from that place, I think was really important, because I think it kind of broke through some of the ideas about what someone who struggles may look like. The other thing that for me like stands out was how, you know, when I think back, I watched the interviews like everyone else did, and you know, watching her struggle to even find the words to communicate like that she had struggled to the point of having thoughts of taking her life, and seeing kind of how present that struggle, you know, was for her, felt, I think it's what it looks like. It's very hard for folks to talk about feeling suicidal. And so, you know, that seeing that, I think really brought home like what this is like.
And Sam, what did you hear when you heard her story and some of the conversation that has transpired since then? What do you think made that effective? Because you're working with youth a lot too.
Yeah, I think I think I was hearing, I love Doreen's mention of, right, like, it doesn't matter what position you hold, what power you have, what presence on the national stage you're having. Like, times can get tough, and that it was the great equalizer. It's the great equalizer that we all can struggle. We all can also look out for help, and I really did find it kind of powerful that she talked about needing that support system, right? Like we know at the Trevor Project that just one supportive person can reduce suicidal ideation by more than 40%, especially for LGBTQ youth, right? So if thankfully you saw sitting right next to her was her one supportive person, and that maybe call me a hopeless romantic, but having a prince say, headlines be damned, I care about you. I care about the hurt that you are feeling. That was a really powerful moment for me. It was this kind of realization for me of, okay, not only does it give the young person who's watching this the recognition of they're not alone. A big worry in all of our communities is this loneliness factor, right? I'm not alone. If a royal can be feeling this, that means that I'm not trying to face this really hard time alone. You mentioned that you've had a suicide attempt. I've had many in my life, and each time I felt like I was the only one in the world going through it, because it's the part that we are trying to break. And so, watching it with watching that interview with my husband, who I know, whenever I'm in trouble or I'm at risk, I can go to and say, like, hey, it's one of those times where I'm not feeling like I should be alone. I'm not feeling like I should be having these feelings. And his reminder of, like, everyone's gonna feel it. If Meghan Markle's gonna feel it, you're gonna feel it. That's okay. Let's go get some ice cream. Let's figure this out together. So yeah, that's what I was feeling when I was watching it.
Thank you. And Doreen, there's one thing that I would love for it to hear you talk about a little bit, which is this idea of having the conversation, because there sort of is this incorrect idea out there that just even discussing this increases the chance that somebody will attempt suicide or engage in some kind of self-harm. Can you talk about the importance of the fact that these conversations are happening and that they are not a harmful factor?
Absolutely. So let's just be clear. There's asking someone if they're having thoughts of suicide, or someone sharing that they're having thoughts of suicide, does not change the trajectory in a negative way for anyone. It doesn't make someone more suicidal. Asking doesn't make someone suicidal who wasn't feeling that way. So no harm is done when that happens. In fact, we have some evidence that actually the opposite is true, that when someone is able to share their distress, feeling suicidal, or when someone asks, that it kind of lets the person know they're not alone, right? They don't have to carry this alone. It doesn't have to be this terrible secret, and that there's help out there and they can connect to help, and that people won't walk away or move away, that there are people who will connect with you when you're struggling. And this is so important because many people who are suicidal feel like they're a burden to others. So you have this kind of challenge where the person who's suicidal is feeling alone, feeling a burden to others, and someone wants to help, but they don't know how to break through that. And so the only way to do that really is to have an open conversation. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You can just say, hey, I'm worried about you. I noticed you've been overwhelmed. Sometimes when people feel that way, they feel bad enough to want to end their lives. Do you feel that way? You don't have to have perfect words. You just need to reach out and connect.
Thank you. Thank you. This actually gets us sort of into the next question that we wanted to talk about, which is, so the article notes that fewer than half of people who are experiencing suicidal ideation will actually tell a friend or a family member that, and that, of those who did die by suicide, only a third of them had received help in the last year. So maybe Sam, we can start with you, and then Doreen, I would love to hear your insight too. Why do you think this is the case? We talked about this sense of being a burden, but especially as we're looking at youth, why is this happening in many cases? And more importantly than that, what are some of the things that we can be doing? What are some of those cues that we can be working into our everyday conversations that might do a better job at signaling to people that they can talk to us?
Let's start. Okay, so why is it a challenge and what do we do about it? Why is it a challenge? we live in an environment of stigma and discrimination. Speaking as an LGBTQ person, that is not just about suicide. That is about, our very lives and our identities. So let's start with, why would people be worried? Can you fathom what was going through Meghan's mind? You had Oprah having to be clear and ask the question, because the word suicide wasn't even able to be brought up. So that level of, if you don't have an Oprah level interviewer, right? That's a person who's really comfortable asking questions. It's literally her job. So if you're a person who's out there, you need to recognize that your words before and after this conversation also had power. Yes, in the moment, asking, are you thinking about suicide, as Doreen mentioned, is really critical. Say the word, say the word, say the word. But also, in the lead up to that conversation, be a person who doesn't say, when you read an article, oh my gosh, I can't imagine that this person would have died by suicide. Oh my goodness, can you believe this? This idea of it could never happen to me and it could never happen to anyone I know makes it a system of silence. And then the same thing can be said for LGBTQ youth specifically in this work, which is, I love the idea of safe spaces, or safety training, right? Where we have a rainbow sticker and you're like, you can talk to me about being LGBT. But wouldn't it also be really important if that rainbow sticker also meant you can talk to me about mental health, you can talk to me about suicide? I'm giving you a clear indicator that I'm ready for the conversation. And I'll end with this really important part. You don't have to be the expert. I think a lot of us think when we get this conversation and this moment happens, Oprah did not have to have the solution. Oprah asked the question. There's a really big difference there, right? Oprah is not Doreen. Right? Oprah does not have a background in how to help, the mental health of a princess. That's not Doreen, that's not her work. But you also don't have to be the expert. You just have to ask the question and then know the resource. At the bottom of this, you'll see, the Trevor Project and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and Crisis Text Line. Those are professionals. Go to those professionals, connect someone, and then you've done it. You were as awesome as Oprah, right? That's an easy thing for me to remember, is ask the question, but then guide them to the professional, and don't think that you have to do it alone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, you could be as powerful as Oprah if you just know these couple of, that's amazing. Doreen, what else? What other little things can people be doing? What should people be conscious of in terms of, Sam, I love the fact that you said, reading about somebody who maybe like Meghan Markle and not making the comment, how could they have, their lives are so perfect, that would never happen to me. What other things should people be more aware of, Doreen, in sort of their everyday interactions, both positively and negatively?
Well, certainly that we all have a role to play here, that suicide isn't just a problem for mental health professionals, that each of us can make a difference, and that we know now, AFSP, we did some Harris polls, and what we found was that more people now believe suicide can be prevented than in previous times. And I think that is because we're talking more openly, we're having conversations like this one. But so I think the important piece to know is that if you reach out, when you reach out, that there's other people doing that every day. And I think the other thing I would say is to not wait to have a conversation about mental health when there's a crisis, to have these be part of our normal day-to-day conversations. People ask me all the time, how are you doing? I'm trying to get better at asking, how are you feeling? How are you coping? Those deeper questions. I think the more we can kind of normalize talking about mental health and our struggles, the easier this is going to get. And there'll be more spaces because there'll be more people ready to have those conversations.
And I think more people skilled in those conversations, understanding the good things to say versus the bad things to say, and even the way we talk about these issues. I don't know if anybody who's listening has noticed, you've heard the phrase people who died by suicide used. That is a very specific reason that we are talking about these issues differently. And actually, Sam, could you explain some of the language around that? Because I don't think people always understand how meaningful that switch is from what they were probably raised saying.
Words have power, words have power, words have power. When you introduced me, and as you can see on the screen, right, my pronouns are they and them. This is something that I always hear, right? When we're at a big event, it's ladies and gentlemen. which immediately makes me feel like, well, I'm not part of this conversation. You're by your words excluding me. So that's a side note, but I just want to make sure to connect it to the point of words have power. So death by suicide is a way of describing an action rather than putting a moral statement on it, rather than creating any type of judgment. It's clearly stating an action. So I'm probably not going to use, let me think here. So because I've been trained so hard to not think about them, you would never say you would say potentially like that a person dies by suicide rather than they, you know, like
committed.
Oh, Dorian, I'm actually kind of floundering here, but you would never say a moral statement. So you would never they committed suicide, right? Like, because that's, again, committed is like a crime, or committed is like you be committed for mental health issues, right? Like these are judgment statements rather than, again, just realizations. Completed versus a non-completed suicide, right? Like these are again, it's not something to finish. It's not a goal here. It's being clear with our words and making sure that we recognize it. It's also, let's be clear, sometimes can be expanded to how we talk about methods of suicide, right? So like at the end of your rope, not really a great metaphor to use, especially if you're thinking about this kind of work. There can be a variety of gun-related kind of statements that come off the tongue to us so naturally. But if you're a person, let's say, who is sitting in a room and you hear this constantly, it kind of gets under your skin of like, that's where we are. That's the options that are ahead of me. So sorry for that kind of like momentary of not being able to quite think of it, but it's because I've been so trained now of, just like I always know to use a person's pronouns, I also know to try to use the best language when it comes to suicide to try to save lives, because words have power. And when we all are actually starting to say things like death by suicide, we'll start to move it away from what can be a really solitary and depressing concept.
Thank you. I think that's really important. It's interesting. I too was trained to use the better terminology and have been using it for such a long time. When you hear the other versions of it, it actually is a little bit jarring because it really does make you realize the conversation fundamentally sounds different in terms of who you were talking about and what the act was. Doreen, I want to talk about what people should be doing. We have a lot of people who watch live. We have a lot of people who watch this afterwards on replays and who are always looking to figure out, what do I do better and how do I move forward? So in one of the articles that we cited today, the author actually said that we need to weaken the walls of silence around suicide. And I always hope conversations like this one and the ones that I hope other people will have will help. Naming it very specifically is a really important strategy. We talked about the fact that Oprah is the one who actually said the word suicide. But Doreen, could you talk a little bit for everyone who's listening and paying attention? What should people do if they confirm that they, in fact, somebody confirms that they, in fact, are having thoughts of suicide or self-harm? What are those steps?
Well, first, you want to listen and really open the door for some conversation. One way I like to think of it is I like for people to get real curious, right? So tell me about that. How often is that happening for you? Do you notice, are there times when it feels worse? How is it now? Get curious. Really want to understand what's happening with your friend's experience, and don't try and solve it, right? Like, you don't need to have an answer, and you may not even understand the distress, but just listen. And then I think that the next thing to do is to reassure the person and say, often when people share that they've felt suicidal, there's so much vulnerability that comes with that. And there's a sense of what will you think of me afterwards? What will others think of me afterward? And so to reassure your friend that, I'm so glad you told me this. This is really important. There is help out there, and I'm going to help you find it. We're going to do this together. I think those reassuring statements can be really important. And then the last thing is help them get help. I mean, we all know that the mental health system sometimes can be challenging to navigate. And if you're feeling suicidal.
Oh,
no, we lost Doreen. Let's see if we can get her back.
Okay. Well, okay. I wanted to talk while Doreen, I was going to follow this up anyway, so we'll go into that. one of the ways that I think is really important when Doreen said like it's hard to access care, we actually found this specifically, especially since this is PFLAG. LGBTQ youth told us that 50% of them had tried to access care, and they weren't able to access it in the first place. Like they wanted that mental health care, they wanted someone to be able to help them with these feelings, but they couldn't access it. Now they couldn't do it for a variety of reasons. We know there's just discrimination being an LGBTQ young person. Let's talk about Arkansas, right? There is the socioeconomic. Not everyone who wants access to mental health care can actually do so. And then of course there's the really important part of just, the stigma of if your parents won't help you get it, how are you going to make sure to get there next? That's where I am. Like I want to make sure that we talk about this idea of, as Doreen mentioned, access to it. Like now that you've tried to build it, think about how hard it may be for them to actually get that last step, that to the resource. So make that as easy as possible. Be a bridge, be a bridge, be a bridge.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even as an adult, it's incredibly difficult to navigate mental health care, no matter how good at you understanding healthcare you are. And I think that that's really challenging. Sam, because we're talking about youth, could you talk a little bit? I mean, I'm hoping that everybody who's watching knows what Trevor Project does, but can you talk about some of the services, like the Lifeline services relative? So if anybody needs help or knows someone, they can get to it?
Love it. I'll thank you for being a good bridge there. Welcome to you connecting people to resources. I love it. Putting it into practice right away. So to those of you who don't know, the Trevor Project has been around for more than 20 years, and we have a variety of different ways that people can access help. First off, we're known for our Lifeline. So you'll see it again, scrolling there at the bottom. 20 years, those phones have not stopped ringing. We are always there to listen. Again, that very first thing that you said for Doreen, we're that person for hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ youth and their parents and their friends who call all together and say, like, I'm having a hard time. What do I do? It's not about having the solution, but we're trying to say, we're going to be here to listen, right? We're going to connect you. So first is our Lifeline. But let's say you're like me and you can't stand to talk on the phone, right? Like, so Sam, that is why we have 24/7, 365 chat and text. So you never have to actually hear another person's voice and don't have to hear your own. Let's bring our trans and non-binary young people into this conversation. Sometimes your voice isn't the greatest. It's not what you want to hear, especially if you're emotional, right? Like I don't know about you, Jean Marie, but like when I am crying, I am not necessarily having the greatest voice that I want to hear.
No,
right?
Not my pretty voice. Not my pretty voice.
Not my pretty voice. Not my singing voice. That's for sure. Right. That's why we have text and chat. So you can always text or chat with us to make sure that you get that like private, confidential, right? I know that we're talking to PFLAG. Not every parent is a PFLAG parent. And sometimes if you're only a door away from your parent, you do have to kind of try to figure out, like, how do I have this conversation about a really tough subject if I don't want necessarily my family to hear about that conversation? I'm not ready for that moment right now. So giving them that access can be really, really empowering. And then, of course, there's Doreen. And then, of course, there is our ancillary services. So after you talk about crisis services, there's also Trevor Space. Think of it like MySpace, to those of you who remember what MySpace is.
We're too used for that, Sam. Stop.
There we go. Okay. Right. Like MySpace, Facebook, right? But it's all LGBTQ youth and their supporters talking about like what it's like to get your first testosterone shot, what it is like to have an accepting parent, what's this cool art that you found. It's a safe social media space that I honestly think doesn't get enough credit for doing what Doreen mentioned earlier about like prevention. Like, let's not let you even get in crisis in the first place, right? Like, let's give you a space where you can feel like, oh, I can talk about this in open and accepting places. It's not a moment for crisis. So if you're ever a person in crisis, don't go to Trevor Space, go to those crisis services, but it's really important. And then of course, advocacy, research, and education, making sure that we do these prevention things, whether through data, through laws, or through, conversations, making sure that LGBTQ youth are being taken care of. So that's how you can learn all about it. All of this is available at thetrevorproject.org/help. Doreen, so glad you were able to rejoin us there.
So glad you're back. We were left here unsupervised without you, Doreen. It was very scary, very frightening time for us.
Technical challenges, my apologies.
It's okay. You know what? I'm going to actually ask Liz to come back in because she mentioned that we had at least one question from people who are watching, and I wanted to see if you could float that for us, Liz.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of really good questions, Jean Marie. So the first comes from Bonnie, talking about a local school which declined to address suicide prevention after a middle schooler took their own life. And their argument was the copycat issues and liability. And clearly there are some really good best practices around how schools can handle this. And you two sure seem like the right people to ask about it.
Okay, so Doreen, do you mind if I start? Because this is like literally one of my favorite things in the entire world. And Doreen knows this because every single time I get to talk about model school policy, I like light up with happiness. So we do have a resource specifically made for this. If you Google the model school district policy or go to the AFSP or Trevor Project website with those services, it's a whole guide specifically on how to address in school and school related suicide prevention. Now there's three major pieces that you need to remember, and I'll go through really quickly and then turn it over to Doreen to talk about that like copycat liability question. Those three parts: suicide prevention. So let's you see your friend has the sniffles. Is it the flu or COVID? We don't really know. Suicide prevention is helping you see the warning signs. Then there's intervention. Intervention's like, you need to go to the doctor, dude. You really need to go to the doctor. This is that time. That intervention for we now know it's the flu. Okay, this is the flu. You need to go. Here's how to get that support, right? And then last but not least is our postvention, which is the doctor's note. How do you re-enter into a system after having a really traumatic, potentially, or crisis, right? Like, let's make sure that you're not having to do all that right away. So Doreen, that's middle school policy in a nutshell. But Doreen, tell us a little bit more about that like copycat liability question.
Yeah, no, I think, what we know about suicide is that, particularly among young people, we know that a large percentage of young people are having suicidal thoughts in their day-to-day lives. So, when there's this sense that if we don't talk about it, somehow we're not liable for it, nothing could be further from the truth. This is happening in school environments. And so what's important is that we talk about it safely, that we connect to resources, and that schools have a plan. And the document that Sam is talking about that both our organizations worked on really is a roadmap for schools to figure out, how do I address this? How do I make sure my school is equipped to address it? And what can we do to have a safe environment for our students, knowing that and on any given day, many of them are struggling with thoughts of suicide.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Liz, I think we have one more question that you mentioned that popped up.
Yeah, I want to bring it up. I want to find it. Apologies. Here we are. From Jamie Henkel, one of our staffers actually. Are there significant indicators for when reassurance and support is appropriate versus someone who must urgently call for crisis support right now?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's hard for, the average person to know, like, how serious is what we're dealing with here. The way I like to think of it is if someone's struggling with suicidal thoughts, that's serious, kind of end of story. But what we do about it, we have a range of options. And the best thing to do is to get a second opinion, get another set of eyes on the situation. So whether that's calling one of the helplines, whether that's going to a mental health professional, bring someone in who's trained, who can say, this is something that, we don't need an immediate crisis response like a hospitalization, or they can say this is pretty serious. The best way to know that is to bring someone in who's trained to do an assessment. And so whether that's reaching out through the helplines or to a mental health professional, that's the best way to know. But I think the other takeaway is that, having thoughts of suicide is not attempting or making dying by suicide. Like that, these are differences and that they exist on a continuum. So many people live with thoughts of suicide and it's not a crisis for them, but that it is an indicator of distress or them feeling overwhelmed. What's important is that we don't try and figure that out for someone alone, that we bring in trained professionals who can really help and work with them and figure out what they need to do next.
And can I ask a quick question? Because someone did ask, and I think it's a really important question. I assume these services, or maybe I shouldn't assume, that these services are open to everyone, including people who are undocumented?
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
So, sorry, go on, Doreen.
No, I was going to say certainly the crisis services that you can call any of these numbers as a concerned person. You don't even need to be the person in crisis. You can call and say, I'm here with a friend, or I have a friend I'm concerned about. What can I do? the numbers will help. So yeah, open to everyone for sure.
Okay, Michael, thank you for asking that question. I just wanted to make sure we saw it.
Well, we are just about at time, unfortunately, and we need to wrap up. Sam, Doreen, thank you so much. I was very nervous about this show, I will admit to you, and having you both here has made all the difference in the world. Thank you for everything that you do and your organizations do, and please reach out to their organizations. Life-saving, quite literally life-saving kind of stuff. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to be with you.
And thank you, Liz.
My pleasure, Jean Marie.
Well, that's the end of the show, everybody. We've done another week together. Please, if you need help, talk to somebody. There is no shame in asking for help or saying that you're struggling. It's normal. It's who we are. We wrap up the same way every single week. We remind you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And again, until we are all okay, wear the mask, wear your mask. And if you can get vaccinated, do it when it's your turn. My second shot is on Monday. Everybody, please have a good week. We will be back here next week to talk about something else new. I think we're doing Earth Day next week. So please join us again. Please be safe. And if you need help, ask for it. Stay safe, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye.